8th, 1945. The war in Europe is over. That sentence, "The war in Europe is over," has been written so many times in so many history books that its weight has been worn smooth. But the weight was real. It pressed down on everything that morning, the Alpine light cutting clean and cold over Austria, the smoke still threading from villages that had been shelled weeks or days before. The exhausted men on both sides of every front who had heard the news and were not yet sure they believed it. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The documents had been signed. The Third Reich, 12 years in the making and built on a foundation of corpses numbering in the tens of millions, had ceased to exist as a legal or military entity. Somewhere above the Austrian Alps, an American military pilot was preparing to make a radio call that had nothing to do with the end of the war, or rather, everything to do with it, in a way nobody who heard it could have fully anticipated. The request that crackled across the frequency was unusual, not alarming, not an emergency, but unusual. The pilot needed a different aircraft, a larger one. The plane he had been dispatched with was not adequate for the mission. This was not a mechanical failure. The weather was not the problem. The issue, relayed to ground command with what one imagines was a tone caught somewhere between the professional and the incredulous, was the prisoner. The single prisoner he had been sent to collect was too large for the aircraft provided. That is the fact at the centre of this story's opening, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Not a cargo hold overloaded with material. Not a transport problem involving multiple detainees or a mountain of equipment. One man, one prisoner, and the plane was not big enough. The request was granted. A larger aircraft was arranged. The mission would proceed, and within hours the man in question, the man around whom this logistical adjustment had been made, who had already, before a single word of formal interrogation had passed, required the American military to locate a bigger plane, was airborne over the mountains, heading toward his first formal encounter with the country that would eventually put him on trial for his life. Nobody could have written this beginning as fiction. It was too strange, too particular, too shot through with the grotesque absurdity that trails power when power finally collapses. The most decorated soldier in Nazi Germany, the man who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of men and directed the obliteration of cities from above, now required a special accommodation just to get him airborne. The logistics of his capture had humiliated the mythology before the mythology had even been introduced. The mountains below are white and indifferent. Spring has not yet fully reached the high passes. Down in the valleys, people are emerging from the wreckage of the last months. Austrian towns that changed hands and then changed hands again. Roads cratered and cratered again. The particular exhaustion of a population that had lived inside a catastrophe for years and was only now beginning to understand that the catastrophe was ending. May 1945 smells of ash and mud, and the first green things pushing through soil that has not been at peace for a very long time. And above it all, a larger plane carries its unusual cargo north and west toward Luxembourg. Stacked in the hold and around the passenger, sources disagree on the exact number, placing the figure somewhere between 16 and 49, are suitcases. There is also a red hat box. There are gold cigarette cases, medals, gems. There is silk underwear and a hot water bottle. There is cash that American inventory officers will later estimate at the rough equivalent of $1 million. And there is something else. Something that will take the officers at the detention center rather longer to fully process. A quantity of narcotic pills that one American official, upon completing his count, will describe in a phrase that stopped people when they heard it and stops people still. But that accounting has not happened yet. The plane is still in the air, the prisoner's name has not been spoken on this frequency, and the audience waiting in the valley below, the soldiers, the officers, the intelligence men, knows only that a larger aircraft was needed. They do not yet know why. They are about to find out. The prisoner's name is Hermann Wilhelm Göring. For those encountering it for the first time, the name means very little. A German name, a surname that belongs to the losing side of a war that ended this morning. But for anyone who has spent time inside the history of the Third Reich, the name arrives with a kind of atmospheric pressure, a weight that goes beyond the physical, though the physical is very much part of the story. At the moment he boards that larger aircraft, Göring is 52 years old. He is wearing a uniform, he has brought his luggage, all of it, every suitcase, the hat box, every case of cigarettes and every piece of jewellery. And he carries himself, even in surrender with the remnants of a bearing that once commanded rooms. He is obese in the manner of a man who has eaten well through years when others starved, his face broad and fleshy. The famous features of the Nazi hierarchy, the jowls, the pale eyes, the general impression of a man who expanded to fill every space available to him, somewhat diminished now but still recognizable. Later, the accounts of the men who transported him and first received him in custody will reach for two particular words: creepy, effeminate. These are the words of American military men who had expected something harder, something more in keeping with the mythology of the Wehrmacht, the cinematic rigidity of the enemy they had spent years fighting. What they found, instead, was this. But to understand what this is, it is necessary to go back. Hermann Göring was, at the height of his power, arguably the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, a position he occupied for years by design and by law. Adolf Hitler formally designated him his successor, an arrangement embedded in the structure of the Nazi state that meant, if Hitler died, Göring ruled. This was not an honorary title. It was an operational fact, codified, documented, and understood by every senior figure in the Reich. He was born in 1893 in Bavaria, the son of a colonial administrator, and from his earliest years he displayed the qualities that would make him both useful to the Nazi project and ultimately a liability within it: an appetite for status, a talent for performance, and a capacity for violence that wore the costume of panache. He flew in the First World War, genuinely flew, with genuine skill, and by the war's end he commanded the Richthofen Squadron, the storied formation named for Germany's most celebrated fighter ace. He returned from that war with more than 20 aerial victories to his credit and the Iron Cross First Class on his chest, and he wore both with the ease of a man who felt he had earned everything he had. The post-war years in Germany were chaos. The Weimar Republic, born in humiliation and financial ruin, staggered through inflation and political violence and the accumulated resentments of a population that had been told the war was lost, not on the battlefield, but by traitors at home. Into this chaos came the National Socialist movement, a coalition of grievances organised around a single magnetic figure. Göring found Hitler in 1922 and recognised in him something the former Luftwaffe ace found irresistible: conviction married to opportunity. He joined the movement, provided it with credibility a street agitator could not manufacture, a real war hero, a decorated pilot, a man of evident social confidence, and became, within a year, the commander of Hitler's paramilitary force, the Sturmabteilung, the Brown Shirts. He was 30 years old. He had already fought a war, survived it, and aligned himself with the most dangerous political movement in Europe. The next 2 decades would be the biography of how that alignment played out. By 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor and the Nazi takeover of Germany began in earnest, Göring was already, in practical terms, the second most powerful man in Germany. The speed of it is worth pausing on. Within months of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933, Göring holds the Ministry Presidency of Prussia, the largest of Germany's constituent states, controlling its police apparatus and its administrative machinery. He creates the Gestapo, the secret political police, from the remnants of the Prussian political police, and he is its first chief. He lays the legal and institutional groundwork for what will become the most comprehensive surveillance and terror apparatus in German history, and he does so quickly, efficiently, and without visible discomfort. He is, in this moment, a man in his element, a man who has always understood that power accrues to those who reach for the instruments of enforcement first. Then there is the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force is, in 1933, officially non-existent, prohibited by the terms of the Versailles Treaty, which ended the First World War and stripped Germany of its military aviation. It exists in shadow form, trained under the cover of civilian flight schools and glider clubs, but it has no official standing, no formal command structure, no name. Göring gives it all 3. He builds the Luftwaffe from institutional fiction into operational reality across the 1930s, drawing on his own prestige as a decorated combat aviator and on Hitler's willingness to fund rearmament regardless of treaty constraints. By the mid-1930s, the Luftwaffe is one of the most modern air forces in the world. By 1939, When Germany invades Poland and the Second World War begins, it is the instrument at the leading edge of a military doctrine, the fast, devastating combined arms assault that will, in the early years, seem to confirm everything Göring has ever promised about what German air power can achieve. He runs the 4-year plan, the program for accelerating German rearmament and economic preparation for a major war, which gives him oversight of a significant portion of the Reich's industrial capacity. He is, in economic terms, one of the men who builds the machine that fights the war. He is Hitler's designated successor. The arrangement formalized in a Führer decree that makes the line of succession explicit. If Hitler dies or is incapacitated, Göring rules, not symbolically, legally. This is the Reichsmarschall at his peak, a man of genuine institutional power, presiding over an air force he built, an economy he manages, a police apparatus he founded, and a succession guarantee that makes him, in constitutional terms, the second man of the German state. He carries the title with the ease of a man who has never seriously doubted that this is where he belonged. But the war does not cooperate. The first crack appears in the summer of 1940, over the English Channel and the farmland of southeastern England. Germany has swept through Western Europe with a speed that shocked even its own planners. France has fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force has been evacuated from Dunkirk, bloodied and stripped of most of its equipment. The conquest of Western Europe that took the First World War 4 years of grinding attrition has taken this war 6 weeks. Hitler looks across the Channel at the last standing enemy on the continent and considers the question of what to do about Britain. Göring has an answer. The Luftwaffe, he tells Hitler, can do this alone. The Royal Air Force can be destroyed by a sustained air campaign, British air defence is broken, and the Channel cleared for a naval invasion. He is confident. He is, characteristically, absolute. He does not hedge. Operation Sea Lion, the plan for the cross-Channel invasion, depends on this promise, and Göring makes it as though the matter is already settled. It is not settled. The Royal Air Force does not break. Through the summer and into autumn, the two air forces bleed each other over English skies, and the RAF absorbs the losses and keeps fighting, its pilots exhausted, and its aircraft constantly repaired and returned to service, its ground radar network providing the early warning that gives every defending pilot just enough time to climb to altitude. The Luftwaffe loses aircraft faster than it can replace trained crews. Göring changes tactics repeatedly, targeting RAF airfields, then switching to civilian bombing, a decision that may have relieved the pressure on Fighter Command precisely when that pressure was beginning to tell. By October 1940, Operation Sea Lion is postponed. It will never be revived. The invasion of Britain does not happen. Germans, in the bitter humour that survives every catastrophe, begin to use a word for the man who promised them the RAF would be destroyed. Early in the war, in a moment of unguarded confidence, Göring had reportedly declared that if enemy bombers ever reached the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, the German people could call him Meyer, a surname so common as to be comically ordinary, a name that carried the implication that something impossible had occurred. By the time American and British bombers begin reaching German cities in force in 1943, the joke has a wide audience. The Ruhr burns, Hamburg burns, Berlin burns. And the man who made the promise is somewhere at Hall, adding another painting to the inventory. Stalingrad is worse. What happens at Stalingrad between November 1942 and February 1943 is, by almost any measure, the single greatest military catastrophe in German history to that point, and Göring's promise is at its centre. The German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, has fought its way into the city on the Volga through months of brutal urban combat. In November 1942, Soviet forces execute Operation Uranus, a massive flanking assault that encircles the Sixth Army and traps roughly 300,000 German soldiers in a pocket around the ruins of the city. Hitler refuses to permit a breakout. The army he orders will hold its positions and be supplied by air. Göring promises that it can be done. The minimum daily tonnage required to keep the Sixth Army operational has been estimated at 300 tons. Göring assures Hitler the Luftwaffe can deliver it. This assurance, given by a man who had spent the previous 2 years watching his air force's actual capabilities fall consistently short of his projections, is received by a Hitler who desperately needs to hear it. The transport aircraft available are not sufficient. The weather over the southern Russian steppe in winter is not cooperative. The Soviet anti-aircraft guns surrounding the pocket are not passive obstacles. The daily tonnage delivered is a fraction of what was promised. On most days, a small fraction. The Sixth Army freezes, it starves, its ammunition runs short, its medical supplies are exhausted. On February 2nd, 1943, Paulus, now a field marshal, promoted by Hitler the day before the surrender, since no German field marshal had ever surrendered, radios his capitulation. Of the roughly 300,000 men encircled, tens of thousands had already died of wounds, disease, and cold before the surrender. Most of those who surrendered would die in Soviet captivity before the war's end. Göring's promise had helped keep them there. After Stalingrad, something changes in how Hitler speaks about Göring, and how the men around him perceive the relationship. The contempt that had been private becomes visible. Hitler references Göring's failures in front of senior staff with a directness that, in the Nazi hierarchy where the Führer's favour was the fundamental currency of power, reads as a form of demotion. The man who once commanded rooms with the authority of Hitler's chosen successor is becoming a figure that Hitler dismisses, interrupts, sometimes mocks. The designated Crown Prince of the Reich is turning, in the Führer's estimation, into a liability. Göring responds to none of this by fighting harder, by reforming his approach, by bringing Hitler evidence that the Luftwaffe is capable of what it is being asked to do. He cannot do any of these things, because the Luftwaffe is not capable, and he knows it. And fighting harder toward a result that cannot be achieved is not a strategy available to him. What is available to him is what has always been available: retreat. Not physical retreat, though there is that too, a gradual movement away from the centres of power where Hitler's contempt is most concentrated. What Göring retreats into is the world he's been building since the 1930s, the private world of Karen Hall, of art and ceremony, and theatrical self-presentation that runs, in these years, entirely parallel to the collapsing war effort outside its walls. Karen Hall stands in the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, named for Karin von Kantzow, Göring's first wife, who died in 1931. He had built a modest hunting lodge as a memorial to her in the early Nazi years. By the war's middle period, it has ceased to be a lodge in any ordinary sense. It is an estate of multiple buildings, including a main residence that has been expanded repeatedly, with a great hall, a crypt containing Karen's remains, stables, greenhouses and outbuildings, spread across grounds that encompass thousands of acres. The art inside it is a record of theft on a systematic scale that Nazi occupation made possible. Paintings, sculpture, furniture, and decorative objects stripped from museums in France, from private collections in the Netherlands, from the homes and galleries of people across occupied Europe who no longer had the rights required to prevent it. Vermeer, Cranach the Elder, Rubens, Rembrandt. Items that had been assembled over centuries in the collections of governments and families and institutions, relocated to the forest north of Berlin because the man who ran the 4-year plan wanted them there. He directs this acquisition personally, working through agents who operate across the occupied territories, with the authority of the Luftwaffe's commander behind them. He is not simply accepting whatever the looting machinery delivers. He is making requests, setting preferences, building a collection with the seriousness of a man who has decided that the identity he is assembling in private, gentleman, connoisseur, Renaissance figure, is more real than the identity he performs in public as a military commander in a losing war. He wears uniforms he has designed for himself, in colours and cuts unlike anything in the regular Luftwaffe wardrobe. Pale blues, hunting greens, white tunics with gold thread. He receives visitors in a study lined with paintings whose provenance would, in any other decade, have made their presence there a scandal. He hunts in the surrounding forest with a spear as often as with a rifle, staging the hunt as a form of theatre in which he is both hunter and led performer. And around all of this, the war continues to lose itself. Hamburg burns in the firestorms of the summer of 1943. Berlin absorbs strike after strike through the winter that follows. American daylight bombers reach deeper into the Reich each month, and the Luftwaffe interceptor force that is supposed to stop them bleeds pilots faster than the training schools can replace them. Göring appears at conferences and makes speeches and issues orders, but the men actually running the air defence of Germany, Adolf Galland, Josef Kammhuber, the pilots and staff officers who understand what is happening in the sky, increasingly work around him rather than through him. His authority is preserved in name and in ceremony. It is being drained, quietly, out of substance. By the spring of 1945, the drainage is complete. The Reich Hitler has ruled for 12 years exists in the space of a few square miles in central Berlin, in the bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery, and in the shrinking pockets of territory still held by German forces in the north, in Austria, in Bohemia, in northern Italy. The eastern armies of the Soviet Union are closing on the capital. The western armies of the United States, Britain and their allies are moving across southern Germany with an ease that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Göring is not in Berlin. He is at the Obersalzberg, the mountain complex above Berchtesgaden, where Hitler had built the Berghof and where the senior Nazi leadership had built their own residences around it. From that mountain, on April 22, 1945, he receives word of what has happened in the bunker. Hitler, in a meeting with staff, has declared the war lost. He has said aloud, for the first time in front of others, that he will remain in Berlin and die there. He has, in effect, abdicated the direction of the war while refusing to leave the city in which it is being lost. Göring reads that news through the lens of a document he has carried, in one form or another, since 1941. In June of that year, Hitler had signed a decree naming Göring his successor in the event of the Führer's death or incapacity. The decree is explicit. It has been treated for 4 years as the constitutional backbone of the Reich succession. And on April 22, 1945, Göring, or the advisors around him, principally Karl Kohler and Hans Lammers, the men who understood the legal architecture of the regime, reads Hitler's declaration in the bunker as precisely the incapacity the decree anticipates. If the Führer has resolved to die in Berlin, if he has withdrawn from the active direction of the state, then the succession clause activates, and the successor is at the Obersalzberg waiting for instructions. Göring drafts a telegram. It is a careful document. It does not seize power. It asks, with formal deference, whether Hitler agrees that the conditions of the 1941 decree have been met, and whether Göring should now assume leadership of the Reich to conduct negotiations with the Allies. It sets a deadline, a specific hour by which, if no reply has come from Berlin, Göring will interpret silence as consent and act. The telegram is sent on the evening of April 23, 1945. It travels through the communications channels that still function between the mountain and the bunker. It reaches Martin Bormann. Bormann has waited years for a moment of this shape. Bormann's whole political existence has been organised around access to Hitler, around the elimination of rivals for that access, and Göring is the largest of the rivals still standing. The telegram in Bormann's hands becomes not a legal inquiry but a coup attempt. He carries it to Hitler with an interpretation attached, that Göring is trying to depose him, that the deadline is an ultimatum, that the man on the mountain has decided the Führer is finished and is moving to take the state before Berlin falls. Hitler, in the last week of his life, in the bunker, exhausted and enraged and dependent on the small circle of people who still had physical proximity to him, believes Bormann. He orders Göring stripped of all offices. He orders him expelled from the party. And 2 days after the telegram is sent, on April 25, 1945, he orders the SS at the Obersalzberg to arrest him. The order is carried out by an SS officer named Bernhard Frank. Göring is placed under house arrest at his residence on the mountain. Within days, as Allied ground forces and Allied bombers close on the Obersalzberg itself, he is moved south, into Austria, to a castle near Salzburg. He is a prisoner not of the Americans but of his own regime, held on the personal order of the man he has served for more than 2 decades, and the SS unit guarding him has been given instructions that in some versions of the account include his execution if capture by enemy forces appears imminent. Whether those instructions were formal or informal, whether they would have been carried out or ignored, is one of the questions that the collapse of communications in the final week makes impossible to answer cleanly. What is certain is that Göring, in the last days of April 1945, is a man under 2 death sentences, one from his own side, contingent on circumstance, and one from history, contingent only on his being taken alive by the wrong army. He watches the situation with the calculation of a man who has spent his adult life reading Power. Hitler is going to die in Berlin. That much is clear. The order of arrest, whoever renews or rescinds it, is going to become moot within days. What matters is not the SS detail in the corridor outside his room. What matters is which army arrives first at the gates. If the Soviets arrive, everything ends in a manner Göring can imagine with precision. Public exhibition, then a rope. If the Americans arrive, he permits himself to imagine something else entirely. The something else is not survival in the ordinary sense. Göring does not appear to have entertained, in these last days, any serious expectation of being permitted to walk free. What he entertains is stature. He has convinced himself, and this conviction is the through line that will make everything that follows so strange to watch, that the Americans, when they take custody of him, will recognize what they are holding. They will understand that he is not an ordinary prisoner. He is the second man of the Reich, the surviving figure of the highest rank, the person who can speak at the moment of surrender for what remains of Germany. He believes, in some form and to some degree, that the surviving accounts make difficult to specify precisely, but impossible to miss in outline, that he will be received as a counterpart, that there will be discussions, that Eisenhower himself, perhaps, will want to meet him, that his knowledge of the regime, his stature, his willingness to negotiate, are assets the Americans will recognize and use, and that in exchange for these assets he will retain something, dignity, standing, some role in what comes after, that other prisoners will not. There is no evidence in the record for any of this. No American commander has sent word offering such a reception. Eisenhower has issued no invitation. The policies being developed at Supreme Headquarters for the handling of senior Nazi captives assume detention, interrogation, and prosecution, not conference. But Göring, in his castle in Austria in the last week of April and the first week of May 1945, does not appear to know this, or does not permit himself to know it. He is preparing for a meeting, and so he packs. This is the detail that everything about the next days will turn on, and it is worth pausing on the fact that the packing is deliberate. Göring is not being handed a suitcase by a jailer and told to fill it. He is at a castle, surrounded by his household, his wife Emmy, his young daughter Edda, staff who have been with him for years, and he has access to the accumulated contents of a life lived at the top of a regime that had permitted him to accumulate whatever he wanted. The paintings from Karen Hall are, most of them, no longer available. They had been evacuated as the Eastern Front approached, dispersed into salt mines and remote depots in the last months of the war. But the movable wealth, the jewellery, the gold, the currency, the personal decorations, the uniforms, the toilet articles, the pharmaceuticals, is with him or can be brought to him, and it is being organised into luggage on the assumption that where he is going, these things will be permitted to go with him. The luggage grows. The counts given by different witnesses and different subsequent accounts vary widely. Some sources describe 16 pieces, others describe more than 40. The variation reflects, in part, the difficulty of counting a moving inventory across several transfers and several days. It also reflects the fact that different observers were counting different things, some including only trunks and cases, others including hat boxes, satchels, valises, and containers of pills. Whatever the precise number, the total is not the luggage of a prisoner. It is the luggage of a man expecting rooms, valets, receptions, wardrobe changes across a period of days or weeks in which appearance will matter and personal comfort will be accommodated. Inside those cases, uniforms, some of them the private designs, in the fabrics and colours that had made him a figure of quiet ridicule in the regular Wehrmacht for years, silk undergarments, a red hat box, decorations, the medals of his First World War service, the decorations he had awarded himself as Reichsmarschall, the sashes and stars of a rank that as of a week earlier had been formally revoked but which he had no intention of leaving behind, gold cigarette cases, a hot water bottle, currency in amounts that, converted forward through the following decades of inflation, will be described in later accounts as the equivalent of roughly $1 million. Jewellery, his own, and in the retellings that will follow, some of it plausibly not originally his own. And the pills. Container after container of the parakadine that he has been consuming for years, in quantities that, when the American officers finally inventory them, will elicit responses that no other item in the luggage produces. He is packing in short as though the transfer to American custody will be a change of venue rather than a change of status. And it is in this state, physically bloated to a weight the surviving accounts place well above 300 pounds, dressed in a uniform pressed for the occasion, chest weighted with metal, luggage arrayed behind him, that he prepares to meet the army of the country he has spent the last 3 years watching bomb his cities into ruin. The meeting is arranged, not stumbled into. In the last days of April and the first days of May, as the German command structure in southern Germany and Austria dissolves, Luftwaffe General Karl Koller, Göring's chief of staff, one of the few senior Luftwaffe officers still functioning as an organised presence, takes on the task of preparing the ground for the surrender. He identifies Fischhorn Castle, a Luftwaffe-controlled property near the town of Zell am See, in the Salzburg province of Austria, as the site where the transfer of custody can be effected in an orderly manner. He makes contact, through the collapsing channels still available, with the American formations advancing into the area, and he communicates to the Americans the essential fact. The Reichsmarschall is present in the region, is prepared to surrender himself, and requests that the surrender be received by a general officer. The American formation moving into the area is the 36th Infantry Division of the U.S. 7th Army, a division known as the Texas Division, drawn originally from the National Guard of that state, hardened by campaigns in Italy and southern France and the drive across Germany. The commander of the division at that moment is Major General John E. Dahlquist. His assistant division commander is Brigadier General Robert J. Stack. When word reaches division headquarters that Göring is in the area and is offering to surrender, it is Stack who is assigned to take him in. On May 7, 1945, the day the German High Command signs the instrument of unconditional surrender at Reims, an envelope reaches Stack. It is addressed not to Stack and not to the 36th Division, but to General Eisenhower. It is from Göring. It proposes, in the language of one head of state addressing another, that Göring surrender himself to Eisenhower personally, and that discussions follow. The envelope is passed up the chain and then down again, and the reply to the substance of the proposal, that surrender to Eisenhower personally will not be arranged, is folded into the practical arrangements for surrender to Stack. Those arrangements are made for the following day. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the day on which the ceasefire across Europe takes formal effect, Stack drives out from division headquarters to meet Göring by appointment on a country road in the Bavarian and Austrian borderland. The setting is deliberately modest for an event that, in another moment, would have justified a formal ceremony: a road, 2 vehicles, a small detail of soldiers, and the second man of the Third Reich waiting beside a car. Stack salutes. The salute is one of the moments that survives clearly in the accounts, because it is one of the moments Göring reads as confirmation of what he's been telling himself for 2 weeks. An American general officer, meeting him on a road, has offered a military salute. The interpretation writes itself, if one is determined to write it that way: recognition, peer-to-peer, diplomatic protocol observed, he is being received, he is escorted to the 36th Division's headquarters. There, Major General Dahlquist meets him. Dahlquist speaks German, and the conversation between the two men is conducted in that language, in private, with a formality that the surviving descriptions call dignified. Dahlquist does not humiliate his prisoner. He does not, at this stage, disabuse him. The prisoner has just surrendered himself and his knowledge without a shot, and the tactical instinct at the divisional level is to treat him in a manner that reinforces the arrangement rather than upsetting it before higher headquarters can decide what to do. Göring is offered lunch. He's served chicken. He's permitted to change into a fresh uniform, one pressed, one with the full array of 12 medals arrayed across the chest in the order he prefers. He's driven to Fischhorn Castle, the property Koller had prepared, and put up there for the night, with his wife Emmy and his daughter Edda accommodated as well. For one night, the arrangement resembles, at least in its external form, the reception he had imagined. He is at a castle. He's with his family. He has been fed. He is in uniform. He has been saluted by an American general. The delusion holds. It holds for perhaps 36 hours. Between May 7 and May 9th, Göring remains at Fischhorn under conditions that any observer would still describe as custody with dignity: meals, quarters, the presence of his family, the deference of the officers immediately around him. He's asked few questions of substance. He's not searched with the thoroughness that will come later. The luggage remains with him. On May 9th he is transferred a short distance to Kitzbühel, and it is from there that the machinery above the divisional level begins to assert itself. 7th Army Headquarters wants Göring for interrogation. 7th Army Headquarters is not at Fischhorn Castle, and it is not going to come to Fischhorn Castle. Göring is going to be moved. The move is going to be by air, and the responsibility for the flight falls to Brigadier General Mayhew Foster, known throughout his career and in every account of his service by the nickname Bo, an American officer with a wartime record substantial enough that the post-war decorations will include the Silver Star and the Légion d'honneur. Foster is a pilot. He has been assigned aircraft appropriate to the tasks his command has drawn, and what is now drawn, in the second week of May 1945, is the task of transporting a single prisoner from an airstrip in the Austrian Alps to a facility in Germany where 7th Army interrogators can begin the work of taking him apart. The initial aircraft assigned to the job is one of the small utility planes standard to divisional and corps aviation in that theatre, an aircraft designed to move an officer and perhaps a small staff, a courier, occasionally a wounded man on a litter. The specifications assume a passenger of ordinary military build. Göring is not a passenger of ordinary military build. He arrives at the airstrip with his luggage, in his uniform, and the moment of the encounter between his physical dimensions and the interior dimensions of the aircraft is the moment that produces the radio call. The plane is too small. Not for the luggage, although the luggage, if it is to accompany him, is also a problem. The plane is too small for the man himself. A larger aircraft has to be sourced. This is not a straightforward matter in the first week after VE Day, when the American air fleet in the theatre is engaged in 100 simultaneous tasks, evacuating wounded, moving displaced personnel, redistributing units, standing down some formations while surging others. But a larger aircraft is arranged, and the arrangement, the ordinary logistical adjustment of matching payload to airframe, produces the first of the moments in which the physical reality of Göring collides publicly with the mythology that had surrounded him. A larger plane, sent up for a single passenger because the passenger is too heavy for the standard one. The story, in the way stories move through an army, does not remain confined to the flight operations staff, it spreads. It becomes one of the first things the men of 7th Army know about their most famous prisoner. The larger plane arrives. Göring is loaded aboard. The pilot on that flight, whose exact identity, across the surviving accounts, is not always the same as Foster himself. There are transport missions and there are subsequent flights, and the recorded impressions attributed to the pilot in later summaries may compress several men into one, records the impressions that will follow Göring into every subsequent narrative of his captivity. The two adjectives that survive most durably are the ones that most confounded the men using them: creepy and effeminate. Neither adjective describes what a young American officer, coming of age in the propaganda images of the war, had been prepared to find when he was assigned to transport a Nazi warlord. The propaganda image was of a Nazi warlord. The reality on the aircraft was of a man with painted fingernails, a man in makeup, a man carrying an aroma of perfume detectable in the cabin, a man whose corseted uniform strained across an obese body, a man whose voice, in the accounts, carried registers and inflections the American observers had not associated with the picture of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that had appeared for years in the newsreels. The word effeminate in the vocabulary of American officers in 1945 was not a clinical or a neutral term. It was a term of dismissal, of contempt, of the specific kind of contempt that soldiers reserved for men whom they had been trained to hate as enemies, but whom, on personal encounter, they could not summon the required respect to hate as equals. Creepy carried a related freight. It described an unease that was not the unease of confronting an evil man. It was the unease of confronting a man who did not fit the shape the observer had prepared for him. The dissonance is worth staying with for a moment, because it will define almost every American encounter with Göring in the weeks and months to come, and it will define the psychiatric evaluation that will begin at Mondorf, and it will define, in the end, the theatrical performance he will mount at Nuremberg. The men who had been reading about Göring in Stars and Stripes, in Life magazine, in the wire dispatches from Europe, had been reading about a figure with a specific outline: architect of the air war on London, protector of Hitler's succession, industrial czar of the slave labour economy, one of the 2 or 3 individuals most directly responsible for a war that had killed tens of millions of people. That outline was accurate. It was, in the sense that mattered most, exactly correct. What the outline had not conveyed was the physical reality of the man inside it. It had not conveyed the weight, the perfume, the manicured hands, the voice, the mannerisms, the theatre. The soldiers meeting that reality had to reconcile it on the fly with the outline they had been carrying, and the reconciliation did not resolve cleanly. Something in it remained wrong. The word for the wrongness in the vocabulary they had was creepy. The flight lands. Göring is moved by ground transport to the site that has been designated for the initial detention and interrogation of the senior Nazi leadership captured in the Western Zones, the Palace Hotel in the small Luxembourg spa town of Mondorf-les-Bains, a resort establishment stripped of its resort character and refitted in the weeks around VE Day as a secure holding facility under the command of Colonel Burton C. Andrus of the United States Army. The facility has been given an operational code name that will attach itself, in the memory of everyone who passed through it, more durably than the official designation. The code name is Ashcan, and the luggage that has travelled with Göring from Austria, the trunks, the cases, the red hat box, the containers whose contents have not yet been catalogued by anyone with the authority to catalogue them, arrives with him and is set down inside the perimeter of Ashcan, and waits in the corridors and receiving rooms of the requisitioned hotel to be opened. They open the first case in a room that smells of requisitioned hotel and recent war. The particular compound of dust, disinfectant, and institutional rearrangement that characterizes every space the American army has recently converted from one purpose to another. The men doing the opening are not archivists or forensic specialists. They are soldiers assigned to a task that no military training program had anticipated: the systematic documentation of the personal property of a former head of state, who is now a prisoner of war, who arrived with the quantity of luggage one might expect of a head of state, and the legal standing of none. The count of suitcases is itself a problem that will follow this inventory through history. Contemporary accounts place the number somewhere between 16 and 49. The range is not a minor discrepancy. It spans a full aircraft's worth of additional cargo. The likeliest explanation is that different accounting methods captured different categories of Göring's belongings at different moments of transit. What was counted at one checkpoint may not have included the additional bags added at another, or may have combined individual cases that later sources separated. The documentary record offers no authoritative tally that resolves the question cleanly. What it offers instead is a consensus on the central fact. The man who arrived at Ashcan had brought with him more personal property than a soldier could carry, more than a diplomat could justify, more than any honest reading of his situation as a prisoner should have permitted. And yet he had brought it all. And it was here, and it was being opened. What comes out of those cases, item by item, tells a story that the war's official histories do not quite tell. The story is not primarily about guilt. The guilt was established by other means and would be adjudicated by other processes, but about self-conception, about what a man believed himself to be and what he believed the world would require him to be even in defeat, and what he had taken with him to ensure that the world could see it. The decorations come early in accounts that have survived, rows of them, the formal awards of a career built on the compulsive accumulation of military honour, a career that had begun in the skies over the Western Front and run through the years of the Weimar Republic's violence and Hitler's political consolidation, and the construction of the Luftwaffe and the long disasters of the air war. The Iron Cross, First Class, the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, the highest Prussian decoration, awarded to Göring in 1918 for his command of the Richthofen Squadron. The Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, awarded in 1940 after France fell, an honour so exceptional that only a single example had previously been conferred in modern German history. A piece of metal and ribbon that had been a personal symbol, a visible argument that he was the second man of a 1,000-year empire. He had packed them all. He had packed them with the apparent intention that someone, at some point on the other side of this capitulation, would want to see them, would perhaps return them to him, would at minimum acknowledge that the man who wore them had at one time commanded an air force and held the succession guarantee of Adolf Hitler. The soldiers cataloguing the decorations put them in a box. The box does not ask what they were for. The gemstones. Sources describe loose stones, unmounted or removed from settings, or perhaps gathered from confiscated jewellery accumulated over years of looting that had moved through the private residences of occupied Europe and arrived by one route or another in the collections at Karen Hall or the Munich apartment or the Berchtesgaden property. Gemstones travel easily. They concentrate value into a form that carries no nationality, no identifying marks, no inconvenient registry of previous ownership. They are what a man packs when he is not certain what currency will be accepted on the other side of the line. Göring had packed them as if he expected to need them, or as if he simply could not conceive of leaving them behind, as if the habit of accumulation, practiced over 12 years of institutional pillage, had become a reflex that the circumstances of defeat could not interrupt. The gold cigarette cases. Multiple sources confirm these specifically, and their specificity is worth a pause. A gold cigarette case is not a necessity. It is a performance. It is the object of a man who understands that the ritual of offering a cigarette is a social transaction, and who has decided that the manner in which he performs that offer should communicate something precise about his position in whatever room he occupies. In the years of the Reich's expansion, Göring had carried these cases into rooms that held crowned heads of Europe, foreign ministers, Wehrmacht generals, industrialists who ran the slave labour enterprises that fed his 4-year plan. In those rooms, the gold case had done its work. What it was supposed to do in an American detention facility is harder to say. Perhaps Göring had not yet accepted that those rooms were behind him permanently. Perhaps the cases were simply there because they had always been there. Because the habits of self-presentation are among the last things a man surrenders, and because surrendering them would have required acknowledging, more completely than he was yet able to, what the situation actually was, the silk underwear. This detail, documented in multiple accounts, generated a particular response among the American soldiers who catalogued it. Not quite amusement, not quite contempt, but the specific quality of dissonance that results from a fact that is simply and irreconcilably wrong in its context. Silk had been wartime contraband in much of occupied Europe for years, diverted to military applications, parachutes, instrument cables, specialized manufacturing, long before the Reich's final collapse. That Göring had it at all was a statement about what hierarchy had meant in practice under National Socialism. The men at the top were not subject to the material deprivations they imposed on everyone else, and the man at the second highest position had maintained the distinction with thoroughness that persisted into captivity. He had packed the silk underwear because it was his, because it had always been there, and the category of things that were simply his had, until very recently, encountered no limiting principle, the hot water bottle. If the gold cigarette cases are a performance of status and the silk underwear is an assertion of privilege, the hot water bottle is something different. It is banal. It is the object of a man who runs cold, or whose back aches, or who cannot sleep without warmth against his body. A man with a body, with physical vulnerabilities, with the ordinary complaints of a 52-year-old who is obese and addicted and has not slept cleanly in weeks. The hot water bottle does not belong to the propaganda image of the Reichsmarschall. It belongs to the bloated, frightened human being who had packed it at Obersalzberg with unsteady hands, or had it packed by an orderly, or had simply pointed at it and said, "That too. Include that." It is the one item in the entire inventory that makes no argument at all, that reaches no audience, that performs nothing. It is a man's private fact about himself, the cash and the valuables. Estimates place the total at roughly $1 million in current equivalent, assembled from currencies and gold and negotiable instruments, representing the liquid portion of a fortune constructed over 12 years of running one of history's most systematically organized theft operations. The Nazis had looted on a scale that no previous regime had quite achieved, stripping Jewish families of their property through legal instruments crafted by men like Göring himself, extracting tribute from occupied nations through economic mechanisms he had administered as director of the 4-year plan, channeling the art and accumulated wealth of a continent through official bureaucracies into the private holdings of the leadership. Göring had been both an architect of this system and among its primary personal beneficiaries. The cash in the suitcases was not, in any coherent sense, simply his money. It was a residue, a portable fraction of an accumulation that had passed through the hands and lives and deaths of people whose names appear nowhere in the catalogue. The Americans entered it all in a separate log. The log does not ask where it came from, and then the soldiers reach the pills. The parakidine is documented across multiple American records in terms that suggest the cataloguers paused before continuing. The drug is a narcotic derivative, chemically related to codeine, producing analgesic and sedative effects and generating, with regular use at significant doses, the physical dependency that makes sudden withdrawal dangerous and continued supply essential to basic functioning. Göring had been taking it since 1923. The beginning was the beer hall putsch, the failed Munich coup that had left him with a gunshot wound in the groin, inadequately treated, producing chronic pain for which parakidine had been prescribed by the German physicians who attended him in the aftermath. That prescription had established a baseline dependency that had been reinforced in subsequent years by dental procedures requiring narcotic management, and then by stress, and then by the escalating demands of running an air force through a war it was visibly losing, and then, as is the nature of these dependencies once they have taken hold, simply by itself, generating its own requirements independent of whatever original justification set it in motion. By the final years of the war, Göring was a man whose days were organised around the drug. The parakidine had shaped his attention, his mood, the rhythm of his energy and his judgment. It had shaped, in ways that no one can fully reconstruct, but that the medical record and the psychiatric testimony of the coming months suggest were significant. Decisions he had made as a commander and as a political figure. The retreat from the operational centres of the Reich, the theatrical self-enclosure at Karen Hall, the grandiose assessments of what his Luftwaffe could accomplish at Stalingrad, all of this had unfolded inside a mind processing the world through a narcotic dependency whose full dimensions were not publicly known, and were not even fully known to those around him. When the Luftwaffe failed, historians looked for strategic explanations, for command failures, for logistical shortfalls. All of those were real. But running underneath them, unacknowledged in the official record, was a chemistry problem. A problem of what the second most powerful man in the Third Reich was doing to his own nervous system, daily, for 22 years. The American army official who examined the pharmaceutical cache did not understate the finding. The characterization entered into the record was this: Göring had arrived at Ashcan in possession of what amounted to nearly the entire world's supply of paracodeine. This sounds, on first encounter, like hyperbole. It was not. The total global productive capacity for pharmaceutical paracodeine in the mid-1940s was not large. The drug was manufactured in specialized facilities, in quantities calibrated to legitimate medical demand, and the available world supply at any given moment was finite enough that a sufficiently determined man with access to the full resources of a national government could, over time, substantially corner it. Göring had done exactly that. The stockpile that travelled with him from Austria to Luxembourg was not a personal supply in any proportionate sense. It was a national pharmaceutical reserve commandeered for a single man's personal dependency. It was the kind of accumulation that requires institutional power to assemble and physical terror to maintain. And it was now sitting in a tagged pile in a Luxembourg hotel in the custody of the United States Army. The question of how much he was consuming daily opens onto the discrepancy in the records that must be confronted directly, because the discrepancy is not incidental. Colonel Burton C. Andrus, the Ashcan facility commander, documented Göring's consumption at approximately 40 pills per day. Captain Douglas M. Kelley, the army psychiatrist who would be assigned to evaluate Göring and who would develop the closest professional relationship with him during the captivity period, later reported figures closer to 100 pills daily. Both men were careful observers. Both were working from direct and sustained encounter with the prisoner. The gap between their figures, 40 and 100, is too large to attribute to rounding or estimation error alone. The most coherent account lives in chronology. Andrus's figure likely reflects consumption in the earliest phase of captivity, the weeks immediately following Göring's arrival at the Palace Hotel, when the supply had been seized and rationed down but the full withdrawal process had not yet begun. Kelley's figure, significantly higher, likely reflects what Göring had been consuming in the final months at Karen Hall and through the days of his arrest and flight. The peak load, maintained right up until the American pharmaceutical inventory removed the supply from his direct control. Read together, the two numbers describe not a discrepancy, but a trajectory. A man arriving at 40 and having come from 100, with everything in between representing the slow demolition of a chemical dependency that had been in place since the beer-soaked chaos of Munich in 1923. It was against this background, this particular human ruin dressed in a corseted Reich Marshal's uniform, with painted nails and a hatbox full of jewellery and enough narcotic to stock a hospital pharmacy, that Captain Douglas M. Kelley reported for duty. Kelley was 30 years old and had already seen enough of the war's psychological wreckage to have developed the kind of diagnostic composure that military psychiatry either produces or destroys in a practitioner. He arrived at the Ashcan facility in Mondorf-les-Bains in May of 1945, with a mandate that was, on its surface, procedural. evaluate the senior Nazi prisoners detained there for competency to stand trial. The legal threshold was not high. The question was whether the men could understand the charges against them and participate meaningfully in their own defence. Under normal circumstances, such evaluations were largely administrative. Nothing about the circumstances at Mondorf was normal. The men Kelley was to evaluate included the architects of the most systematic mass murder in recorded European history, and his job was to sit across a table from them, look into their faces and determine what, if anything, was clinically present. His mandate was competency. What he found was something else entirely, and it would stay with him for the rest of his life. Göring, by the time Kelley sat down with him, was already beginning to clarify. The narcotics were gone, or nearly gone, rationed to nothing by Andrus's instructions and the physical impossibility of resupply, and the fog that had layered itself over Göring's cognition for 2 decades was lifting day by day with the particular cruelty of withdrawal, which does not simply remove the narcotic state but tends, in its passage, to produce a kind of raw, scraped lucidity before the nervous system stabilizes. What emerged from beneath the paracodeine was not what anyone had expected. Kelley had presumably prepared himself, at some professional level, for the clinical profiles associated with violent extremism. The dissociative features, the paranoid structuring, the flattened affect or the grandiose ideation that clinical literature associated with men who organised atrocities. He had his test ready. He had his instruments in order. What he encountered instead was a man who was funny. This is the word that surfaces in various forms across the accounts of people who dealt with Göring in the Mondorf period, and it is worth sitting with because it is so incongruent with every other fact of his existence. He was witty, in the specific and slightly exhausting way of a man who had performed his own intelligence for decades and had refined the performance to something approaching art. He was quick with names, with historical references, with the kind of contextual detail that signals a genuinely retentive mind rather than merely a well-rehearsed one. He was, by Kelley's account, charming, which is a word the psychiatrist used carefully and did not mean kindly. Charming, in Kelley's clinical vocabulary, meant that Göring possessed a social facility that moved naturally across registers, that he could read a room, that he understood exactly what impression he was making on any given individual and adjusted his performance accordingly. It was the charm of a man who had operated at the top of a totalitarian hierarchy for more than a decade, which is to say the charm of someone who had survived in proximity to Hitler, which required a specific and disciplined form of social intelligence that most people do not possess, and that no clinical instrument had been designed to detect. Kelley administered the Rorschach tests. He sat across from Göring with the ink blots, the same instrument he would administer to all the senior prisoners, seeking the projective patterns that the test was designed to surface, the intrusions, the distortions, the signs of thought disorder or affective flattening, or the specific configurations of response associated with the diagnostic categories he was working through. Göring's results were coherent. His responses were organised, contextually appropriate, sometimes imaginative in a way that reflected genuine engagement with the material rather than mechanical performance. There was no clinical finding in the Rorschach that pointed toward the kind of psychological pathology that might explain, at the level of individual diagnosis, what Göring had done. The inkblot showed Kelley a high-functioning mind in a functional state, not a monster in the clinical sense that the word monster implies, something detectably, measurably different from the ordinary range of human variation. What they showed him was a man. This was, in the silence of the Luxembourg Hotel where Kelley worked through his notes each evening, the most disturbing finding imaginable. Because Kelley had come, as any reasonable person would have come, with the implicit assumption that a man who had helped design and administer the systematic murder of millions of human beings, who had signed orders, who had built administrative structures, who had sat at the table when decisions were made about what categories of people would be stripped of their property, their rights, and their lives, must be, at the clinical level, something other than what the instruments were showing him. That assumption was not merely personal. It was, in some sense, necessary. If the men who organised the Holocaust were clinically ordinary, if they scored normally on intelligence assessments and showed no diagnostic markers that distinguished them from the range of human variation that populated any given office building or university faculty, then something very terrible followed from that finding, something about the relationship between ordinary human psychology and atrocity that no one in 1945 was prepared to fully absorb. Kelley was not prepared for it either, but he was honest enough to write what he found. He documented Göring's high IQ scores. He documented the coherence of the Rorschach responses. He documented the charming, almost magnetic personality he had noted in their sessions together, and he documented with the kind of precision that comes from someone who has spent many hours in direct conversation with the subject, the way that Göring used the relationship itself, the dynamic of being evaluated, being attended to, being the centre of a sophisticated man's professional attention, as a form of sustenance during the withdrawal period. Kelley had not designed it this way deliberately, but the engagement itself, the intellectual contest of the psychiatric interviews, had become part of the mechanism by which Göring was managing the absence of the narcotics. The attention replaced, in some functional way, what the paracaidine had been providing. Not the chemistry, nothing replaced the chemistry, but the stimulation, the sense of being in a charged and demanding situation where his faculties were required. Göring, it turned out, needed to be the most interesting man in any room he occupied, and Kelley, to his own discomfort, had given him a room. The conversations ranged widely. Göring spoke about the war with the candour of a man who had nothing left to protect and considerable interest in managing his posthumous image. He spoke about Hitler with what Kelley read as genuine mixed feeling, real admiration for what Hitler had built politically in the early years, real contempt for the military decisions of the final ones. He spoke about the Luftwaffe with the proprietary pride of a founder who had watched his creation destroyed by operational realities he refused to have fully understood. He was not confessional. He did not offer anything that looked like guilt in a recognizable form, but he was analytical, willing to examine the machinery of the regime from the inside in ways that suggested he understood how it had worked, which was itself a kind of implication. He was, Kelley concluded, sane. He was, in every clinical sense of the word, fit to stand trial. He was, on the available evidence, one of the most psychologically ordinary men Kelley had encountered in the prisoner population. And this finding, which should have been reassuring, was instead the source of a professional and personal crisis that would follow Kelley out of Luxembourg, through Nuremberg, and into the rest of his life. The transfer to Nuremberg came in August of 1945, as the legal machinery for the trials assembled itself. By then, Göring had lost a substantial amount of weight. The withdrawal from paracaidine had stripped something from his frame, not just the narcotic bloat, but a kind of physical inflation that the drug had maintained for years, a puffiness of feature and expansion of silhouette that had become so associated with his public image that the thinner man who emerged from the process looked to people who had known him before subtly wrong. His face had sharpened. His eyes were clearer. The man who arrived at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice was recognizable as Göring in name and history, but the body that carried that name had shed enough of its excess that the theatrical absurdity of the Ashcan arrival, the painted nails, the silk underwear, the corset straining against its task, had given way to something more concerning. He was, stripped of the drugs and some of the weight, mentally present in a way that he had not been for years. And mental presence, in Göring's case, was not a comfort. The International Military Tribunal convened in November of 1945. The defendants sat in 2 rows in the dock, 21 men, the surviving architecture of the Third Reich, in suits and uniforms stripped of their insignia. Göring sat at the far left of the front row, which was the position assigned to the man the prosecution considered the most significant living defendant. He had understood immediately what this meant. He had been given, in the logistics of the seating arrangement, a form of the supremacy he had spent his entire political life pursuing. He was, in this courtroom at least, first among equals. He used the position with everything he had. From the opening days of the proceedings, it was clear to the other defendants and to the prosecutors alike that Göring regarded Nuremberg as a theatre and that he intended to direct it. He held sessions with the other defendants during exercise periods, advising them on their testimony, counselling them on how to answer specific lines of questioning, building a coherent collective defence posture from the fragments of 21 individual legal strategies. Some defendants resisted him. Others, particularly those who had spent years accustomed to following his lead, fell back into the old hierarchical patterns as naturally as if the war had not ended. Göring's argument was consistent and strategically intelligent. The trial was victor's justice. Every great power in history had conducted wars of expansion and strategic bombing and political repression, and the charge that Germany had done so was not a charge against Germany uniquely, but against the nature of statecraft itself. He was not offering this as an exculpatory argument in a legal sense. He was sharp enough to know it would not serve as one, but as a reframing device, a way of positioning the proceedings as illegitimate in principle, and thereby positioning whatever verdict emerged as historically contestable. Under cross-examination, he was formidable in ways that visibly frustrated the prosecution. He had spent months at Mondorf and Nuremberg reading the documents the prosecution intended to use against him, building a familiarity with the evidentiary record that the Allied attorneys had not anticipated in a defendant who was also managing his co-defendant's strategies. He challenged interpretations of documents. He offered alternative contexts. He pressed on inconsistencies in the prosecution's chronology, with the persistence of someone who had spent the better part of a year doing nothing else. The British prosecutor Sir David Maxwell Fyfe ultimately broke through during cross-examination on the murder of escaped Allied POWs from Stalag Luft III, the Royal Air Force officers whose killing Göring could not coherently claim ignorance of and whose case the prosecution had prepared with particular thoroughness. But even there, Göring did not collapse. He adjusted, reframed, kept his composure under conditions that had dismantled other defendants entirely. Whatever the drugs had taken from him over 22 years, whatever the paracadine had muffled or distorted in his judgment and his effect, the mind underneath, the mind that had run the Prussian state police and built the Luftwaffe from nothing and administered a continental war economy, was intact. It had been waiting beneath the dependency for decades, and it had one last performance to give. The verdict came on October 1st, 1946. Guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, the waging of aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. Göring received it without visible disruption. He had known it was coming. He had, in the testimony he gave and the arguments he made, conducted himself throughout the proceedings as a man who understood that the outcome was not going to be acquittal, and who had therefore committed his remaining energies entirely to the historical record, to the question of how he would be remembered, which had always, from the earliest days of the Nazi movement, been a question that mattered to him more than almost any other. He had lost. He had lost the war, lost the trial, lost the narcotics, lost the Karen Hall estate, and the stolen paintings and the theatrical uniforms and the 30,000 acres of forest where he had played at being a Renaissance prince while Europe burned. But he had not yet lost the manner of his leaving. The execution was scheduled for the early hours of October 16th, 1946. The condemned men would be hanged in sequence in the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison. Göring was to go first. On the evening of October 15th, he was visited in his cell by the Protestant prison chaplain, who found him composed. He was visited by an American officer who confirmed the timing. The cell was searched, as it had been searched many times before, for contraband. Nothing was found. Sometime in the hours that followed, between the last security check of the night and the pre-dawn hour when the guards came to take him to the gymnasium, Hermann Wilhelm Göring bit down on a small glass capsule that had been concealed somewhere, in his body, in his cell, in some crevice of the facility that had been examined dozens of times and had yielded nothing, and was dead within minutes from cyanide poisoning. He was 53 years old. He had been a prisoner for 560 days. The question of where the cyanide came from has never been definitively answered, and this is not a rhetorical hedge. It is a genuine historical fact, confirmed across the decades of subsequent inquiry, that the origin of the capsule remains unsettled. The theories are numerous and mutually exclusive. It may have been concealed in a hollow compartment of a fountain pen that had survived the inventories. It may have been secreted in a cold cream jar among his permitted personal items. It may have been passed to him by a sympathetic American soldier, whose identity, if the transaction occurred, was never established with certainty. It may have been held in a body cavity that the security protocols of the period did not reliably address. Andrus, who had constructed the security apparatus at Ashcan and had carried it forward to Nuremberg, was devastated and furious in a way that suggested genuine bewilderment rather than institutional cover. He had believed the facility was secure. He had believed the prisoner was contained. He had been wrong about both, and the wrongness was absolute and irreversible. The cyanide capsule was small enough that it had travelled undetected through every layer of scrutiny that the United States Army had applied to this particular prisoner across 17 months of captivity. It had survived the Ashcan inventory. the same inventory that catalogued 40 or 49 or 16 suitcases of personal property, down to the individual silk undergarment. It had survived the transfer to Nuremberg. It had survived the cell searches that were conducted on a regular basis throughout the trial, the same institutional attention that had weighed and sorted and tagged every object Göring carried into American custody. The hatbox, the gold cigarette cases, the loose gemstones looted from occupied Europe, the pharmaceutical stockpile that amounted to nearly the world's supply of a controlled narcotic, had failed to find the one thing that mattered. The army had successfully seized everything that represented his wealth, his status, his theatrical self-conception, his pharmaceutical dependency. It had missed the one object whose value was irreplaceable. There is something in this that goes beyond the operational failure, beyond the security lapse that Andrus would spend years trying to account for. Consider what the cyanide capsule represents against the full arc of what Göring had carried into American custody. He had arrived in May of 1945 on a larger-than-standard aircraft, surrounded by a personal hoard so extensive and so particular that its inventory reads like a portrait. The medals of a military career, the jewels of a looting operation, the currency of a police state, the pharmaceuticals of a 22-year dependency. All of it had been discovered, catalogued, and removed. All of it had been extracted from his control with the systematic thoroughness that the American military applied to the processing of captured enemy leadership. The suitcases had been opened, the hatbox had been inspected, the pills had been counted and then taken away. The Reichsmarschall had been weighed, measured, evaluated by a psychiatrist, tested with ink blots, stripped of his name by men who refused to use his rank, and ultimately placed before an international court to answer for crimes that required a new vocabulary of law to adequately describe. And through all of it, the capsule had travelled with him, invisible, inert, waiting. Carried through the checkpoint at Fishhorn Castle, through the cargo hold of the larger aircraft, through the corridors of the Palace Hotel in Mondorf, through the transfer to Nuremberg, through 560 days of captivity that had stripped away everything else he possessed. The man who had cornered the world's supply of one substance died by a substance that no one could account for. The Reichsmarschall, who had been too large for the first aircraft sent to collect him, departed his cell by a method that left no physical evidence of how it had arrived there. The prisoner whose luggage had required an inventory that stretched across days died, having smuggled something past every instrument the army brought to bear. Kelley, who had spent months across a table from Göring and had written carefully about what those conversations had revealed, the charming, magnetic personality, the high IQ scores, the disturbing absence of clinical deviance, would carry this story with him for years. His book, published in 1947, examined not just Göring but the entire dock at Nuremberg, and its central argument was as uncomfortable as the Rorschach results that had produced it. The men who had built and operated the machinery of the Nazi state were not, by any available clinical standard, a distinct psychological type. They were not detectable in advance by any instrument. They were, in the measurements that Kelley had applied, ordinary, which meant, by implication, that the conditions that had produced them were not extraordinary either. The Nazi leadership had emerged from human material that was not specially damaged, not biologically or psychologically marked, not fundamentally different from the material available in any society under sufficient pressure and with sufficient institutional permission. Göring, specifically, had been exactly what Kelley's tests showed: a highly intelligent, socially adaptive, narcissistically organized man who had been given institutional power and had used it without restraint, in a context where restraint had not been required of him by anything external to his own conscience. And his own conscience, the test suggested, had not objected. That is what Captain Kelley found in the Palace Hotel in Luxembourg in the summer of 1945. That is what he carried out of Nuremberg in 1946 and spent the rest of his professional life trying to explain. He died in 1958 on New Year's Day by cyanide poisoning, a circumstance so uncanny in its echo that it has never been entirely explained either. Whether that was accident, intention, or something in between, the case file does not resolve. What the documentary record does resolve is narrower and more precise. On May 8, 1945, a larger-than-expected aircraft landed in Austria to collect a prisoner, and that prisoner climbed aboard surrounded by more luggage than could be easily accounted for, carrying more of a narcotic than the world could easily supply, wearing more decoration than any rank required, and representing in his enormous, ornamented, chemically compromised person the full weight of what the Third Reich had built and squandered and lost. The inventory of what he carried was long and detailed and eventually complete. The cargo hold was cleared, the suitcases were opened, the pills were counted, the medals were tagged, the gemstones were logged, the gold was weighed. Somewhere in the hold, or on his person, or folded into something that passed through every inspection without being found, was a small glass capsule containing a substance that would not be discovered until it had already done its work. The man who arrived with everything left with nothing. Except that. Except the one thing that no one could find, which turned out to be the only thing that mattered, and which he had, in the end, been carrying all along.